Okay, so this tutorial is going to show a couple things. I hope to show you how to set up a 360-degree camera to produce panoramic images that will map onto spherical projections for things like environmental lighting or kind of environmental images for backdrops for all sorts of applications. So what I have right here is a city grid that's repeated 5 times. I'm going to select my camera and I'm going to split my view so I can see camera view, and I'll go into view and viewport, viewpoint, camera. And then I'm going to, let's see here, go into my view and I'll rough out kind of the center, more or less the center. I want to kind of start in an area like in between those kind of like green towers there. So I'll kind of raise it up a little bit. And then I'll go into my view and maybe right side, and then make sure that I'm kind of like just above the, there we go, that looks good. I like looking at that. So I'm just kind of above the rooftops. And so the camera at this point, like it's kind of looking down, but in a 360 degree, it's going to be looking all around you. So the camera is going to be the center of the kind of spherical projection. So that's going to be important when you think about where to set your camera up. All right, the next thing that I want to do is now change this camera from that default settings, and I want to give it the panoramic settings. So I need to do that in a couple spots. The first spot is here in my render properties. I want to make sure I'm using the cycles. By default, I think render Blender is now defaulting to Eevee, so make sure you're in the cycles render engine. And we're going to play around with this, these samples in a minute. And then under the output properties, you want to make sure you're using a resolution that's 2:1. I'm just using 2,000 pixels by 1,000 pixels for ease of math. And then I'm going to, all of these other settings I think are fine for now, except, yeah, that's true. So that is essentially the kind of, and I need to go in and set the camera itself. So select the camera itself, go into the camera properties tab, and then make sure you're changing your type of camera from perspective to panoramic. And we're going to use the equirectangular, I don't know why I can't say that, camera. And then I think that is it from that tab. And then the next thing that I want to do is use something called the Denoise feature, and this ships with bundled into Blender, and it is right here under denoising. So under sampling and denoising, I want to make sure this is checked next to these options. There's a few different types of denoisers that use different algorithms. The NLM is kind of like the first generation, and it's actually really good for certain applications. We're going to maybe test these a little bit. The OptiX is actually only for, it makes use of GPU rendering, but only works with if you have an NVIDIA graphics card. And then the Open Image Denoise, which is a CPU Intel's CPU-based denoiser, which I like a lot, so I'm going to use that one. All right, so I think that's it for my render setup. Again, the viewport is set to 32 samples. I find that with this denoiser, you can get away with, I mean, probably even less than that, but let's just test it. It's only 5 samples per image. And then what else do I want to do? I want to light my scene. So right now I don't have a light in my scene, so if I go into my render preview node, you'll see it's really quite dark. The other thing that you'll notice is that, well, it's really quite dark. So let me draw your attention to the other thing that you'll notice once I actually light my scene. I'm going to move back to my texture node just because I'm on a laptop and it is not that snappy. All right, so I'm going to use this this HDRI image. It's not really an HDR, it's this panoramic image. It's essentially kind of something similar to what we'll be creating. If you kind of create a, it's an image that's meant to be mapped onto a sphere. So I'm going to use this to light my scene. The way that I do that is by going into I'm going to go into my shading network node and change my view from object into world. And then I've already got it set up here. So let me just delete that. So what I did then is Shift A, and I added a texture and an environment texture. And I connect the color to the background, and I said open. And I found that in my downloads, city, something or other, night, city, modern. Beautiful poetry to create these titles. All right, so now this is driving my background. I can test here by switching into my cycles preview node, and then now I'm getting a lot more color data or lighting data in there. That's great, but it's still a little dark. So I think what I'd want to do is maybe change the strength from 3 to maybe 5. Let's see how that goes. And that's just going to increase the amount of light. Yeah, that looks a little bit better. We'll see how that goes. The other thing that I did was under my world properties tab, I went into ray visibility. Let me actually change this. Actually, let's go into my view, my camera view. Viewport camera. And I turned the HDRI or the background image off so that you're not actually seeing it in the render. I'm going to turn it on for this test because I think it just helps kind of to kind of get a sense of like orientation. But you can turn that on or you can turn that off. So if you want the image just to light the scene, you turn it off. Under ray visibility, you turn it off to the camera, and then again that's in the world properties tab. I'll turn it on right now just to help us kind of make sense of this image that we're creating. Okay, so that is kind of that. I can see that, let me zoom into this a little bit, and so you can see like cycles kind of moving through its passes, its samples, and with each pass it kind of gets a little bit clearer and a little bit clearer. We're at 8 samples out of 32 right now, and it's still quite noisy. So let's do a couple tests with the render settings. So back into my render properties tab, I'm going to, this is these samples that I'm talking about. So the viewport, it's going to max out at 32 samples and then it's going to stop sampling. So I'll just let that run so we can kind of get a sense for what 32 samples looks like without the denoiser. And it'll just be a couple more seconds here. Okay, so this is 32 samples, and you can kind of see the noise, so these little fireflies and kind of like static on the tops of these buildings, and then definitely in the kind of background as well, and in these kind of highlight features. So I'm actually going to run my render at the same number of cycles, which is 32, and then but it will have the denoising turned on. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. I'm gonna maybe decrease the size right now to maybe like 50%, just so it doesn't take as long here. So under my rendering tab, I can go in. This is my previous render here. I'm gonna go into my render and render image. So you'll see like these kind of first passes. Those are the cycles passes running at 32 samples and maxing out there. And then you'll see this kind of like secondary pass happening right here, which is going in and denoising. So that's the denoising filter. So it's using machine learning algorithms to denoise. And you see now that all of these kind of tops are like smoothed out. So you start to see the pixels right here because it was kind of a small image already, so that's moving quite speedily. So let's render it out at 100% and see how that looks. Okay, so I just want to go in before those passes start kind of, you can eating away all the noise, which is lovely. I want you to kind of see what's going on. So each one of these little cubes is getting denoised at this point. Okay, and now we are done, and this looks great. So any of this kind of like artifacting that you see in the background, that's in the original image that I was using to light the scene. Again, it was pretty low resolution. I wouldn't normally use this for kind of a background, but I think it does help us kind of, orient ourselves in this image. So I'm going to say image and save as. This is my test 2. And I'm going to say compression 0. I usually like to, actually, what I really like to do is save an uncompressed TIFF and none for all of my kind of my archival files. And then if I need to, I can compress those like in a batch using Photoshop or something, or even in Blender itself. So I tend to render out in TIFF uncompressed file formats or uncompressed PNG file formats. Right. And then I'm going to shut this preview down. I'm going to go back into my layout mode, and I'm going to add a sphere. And I'm going to apply that image texture to the sphere so that we can get a sense of what this might look like if you're using it to drive color data. I'm going to hit S for scale. And we'll just move this out here. And then I'm going to give it a new texture. And I'm going to say new. And I want to go into my shading node and change from world to object. And then I'm going to shift A to add a texture, an image texture. And I'm going to come out of the color node here into the base color here. Oh, I didn't even open the image, that's why. Haha. So excited to show you all. All right, so here's the render test 2, open image. We'll go back in there into layout mode. All right, so there is the image kind of on the sphere. And it doesn't look quite right from outside. I might actually even rotate this a little bit. It's flatter. But once you go, it might not let me. Sometimes there's these strange. Okay, so just some sort of bug that wouldn't let me zoom in and out of the sphere, but I kind of solved that by just increasing the scale of the sphere around me, and now it seems to be working okay. So I'm not sure exactly what was going on there, but let me, it's also kind of a little low, so I'd want to raise this up above me a little bit more, and I can also see there's all of this kind of sheen on it, so I'm going to bring down the specular and bring up the roughness of my material, and that's going to allow me to get a much better kind of sense for the image itself, so you can kind of see all of this gorgeous kind of panoramic detail. This is all just from the render, that image that we just made. And if I wanted to turn object smooth shade, that'll help get rid of those little facets that we're seeing up kind of around the image too. So so that's gorgeous, right? And then we can kind of look down. There's my little model, the grid, and I can see like the tops of the buildings when I look down. So you can see this could be a really useful tool to create your own HDRI images, or like, environment images, or if you're creating like a VR environment or anything, and you want kind of a spherical environment to enclose you without adding a ton of geometry, this is super useful. All right, so that is it for the still images.